Oh, welcome to the debate. Today, we're tackling a really pervasive and often misunderstood tension, the complex relationship between shyness and introversion. Now, these concepts, while related, are defined by our source material as fundamentally distinct psychological phenomena. Yet society just persistently treats them as interchangeable. And this conflation, it has pretty profound implications for how we structure our workplaces, how we educate our children, and frankly, what we decide constitutes a successful personality.
And that conflation is the perfect way to frame our central disagreement today. The core question for us is this. Is shyness a genuine, restrictive hindrance, an individual, unwanted emotional state that's rooted in fear and must be actively dismantled by the person experiencing it? Or is shyness fundamentally a consequence of a societal failure to accept and accommodate introversion as a valuable, even necessary personality type?
Right. And my position is that shyness, when you strictly define it as the fear of negative social evaluation, is an emotional barrier that absolutely demands individual attention. It actively limits opportunity and it degrades mental well-being. Therefore, it has to be proactively addressed, neutralized for personal growth, regardless of whether someone is an introvert or an extrovert.
And I'm going to argue that our priority has to be systemic, that we need to fully embrace introversion and dismantle this pervasive extrovert ideal. I would assert that much of what gets pathologized and labeled as disabling shyness is simply an introvert's, legitimate and rational discomfort with environments that are designed to reward speed and volume over depth and reflection. We have to fix the system first.
Okay, so to start, I think we have to be absolutely precise with our definitions, because that distinction really changes the course of action. Introversion is a neutral personality trait. It's just a preference for internal processing and low-stimulation environments. Shyness, though, is a specific emotional state defined by fear, specifically the fear of judgment, and that fear manifests as avoidance behavior. The evidence is pretty clear that this avoidance spiral acts as a concrete and severe barrier. I'm not talking about, merely being uncomfortable at a big party. I mean the inability to speak up in a critical team meeting, the failure to negotiate a deserving salary increase, or the chronic self-sabotage that prevents an individual from applying for a leadership role they are perfectly competent to fill. This isn't about personality preference. This is about an active psychological limitation that prevents self-advocacy.
Okay, I acknowledge the barrier you're describing, but I'm going to challenge the premise that these scenarios are failures of the individual. I think they're failures of context. When you describe the inability to speak up in a critical team meeting, you're defining success solely through the extroverted requirement of speaking up. We have to ask, why is oral performance the only metric of contribution? Introversion, fundamentally, is a deep source of strength. It enables sustained concentration, methodical and complex problem solving, and reflective, strategic leadership. By focusing so much on overcoming shyness, which often just means forcing behavior that is deeply draining to an introvert, we neglect these immense strengths and we push people toward a kind of behavioral flexibility that ultimately undermines their most valuable cognitive processes.
Sure, I agree introversion provides valuable strengths, but ignoring the emotional toll of shyness fundamentally degrades mental health. The core mechanism is fear. And fear leads to avoidance. This chronic avoidance, it shrinks the individual's world, leading directly to higher rates of social anxiety, isolation, and lower self-esteem. And that's irrespective of their natural preference for solitude. Overcoming shyness is not about changing one's preference. It's about neutralizing a psychological vulnerability that limits participation in, necessary collaborative or civic life.
Assumes that this necessary collaborative life must be conducted under the current high-stimulation rules. I would contend that the fear response, what you're calling shyness, is often learned through negative social reinforcement, particularly within what we call the extrovert ideal. This is the cultural phenomenon that disproportionately rewards fast decision-making and loud, dominant, almost performative speaking styles. When an introvert hesitates, gathering their thoughts before speaking, they're often interrupted or dismissed. This repeated social injury teaches them that the environment is hostile, making their fear response rational not pathological. Why demand individuals undergo behavioral modification to tolerate toxicity when we could just remove the source of the toxicity?
Well, now we're getting to the core mechanism of our disagreement. Whether the fear is innate or purely a consequence, you argue that if the environment validates introversion, the fear of evaluation diminishes. I argue that avoidance, regardless of its initial trigger, perpetuates the fear cycle. We see this in psychological literature. Shyness is often driven by a pretty deeply rooted mechanism related to the overactivation of the amygdala in response to novelty or potential judgment. If a shy individual avoids giving a presentation, okay, they've succeeded in avoiding the immediate threat. But they have also reinforced the neural pathway that says social interaction is dangerous. This avoidance strengthens the fear. It creates a downward spiral that systemic reform, however beneficial, can't entirely counteract. The emotional barrier has to be dismantled internally.
While I appreciate the emphasis on the biological mechanism of fear, and I don't deny the existence of clinical anxiety, I question the necessity of forced exposure as the default solution for everyone we label shy. You are requiring the individual to constantly engage in self-intervention to manage an anxiety response to a context that is fundamentally hostile to their nature. Instead, let's consider how accommodation can preempt the development of that self-reinforcing fear. If society values introverted methods, implementing structural changes like quiet zones, providing detailed agendas well in advance, and favoring asynchronous communication like email over an immediate oral response, the pressure to perform is reduced. If the environment is perceived as safe and reflective, why would the fear response generalize and strengthen in the first place? We have to look at the environmental input that fuels the anxiety.
But life, particularly in dynamic professional and civic spheres, is fundamentally collaborative and, unpredictable. We can't engineer a world that's free of unexpected interactions, spontaneous negotiations, or moments when immediate engagement is crucial. A certain degree of comfort and functional capacity in high-pressure interaction is necessary for basic societal function, let alone leadership. I'm not advocating for forcing an introvert to become the life of the party. I am arguing that the inability to engage when it's necessary is the very definition of a functional limitation. Overcoming shyness is necessary not for conformity, but for functional self-efficacy, the belief that you can influence events affecting your life. When fear paralyzes action, that self-efficacy just vanishes.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the definition of self-efficacy must be predicated on oral performance. That's a fundamentally one-size-fits-all approach rooted in extroverted communication styles. True personal growth, I think, comes from self-acceptance and from leveraging one's natural strengths, which for introverts means optimizing conditions for deep work. If an introvert excels at complex strategic planning but is terrified of leading a town hall meeting, their growth should focus on securing roles that utilize their deep processing abilities, and maybe ensuring the town hall could be handled by a delegate or through written material. The goal shouldn't be forced sociability, it should be effectiveness. We should only manage the anxiety, overcome what you call shyness, when they desire to use an extroverted skill for a specific personal goal, not because society demands conformity.
That's a compelling argument about self-determination, but it assumes that accommodation will always be there precisely when it's needed. What about the inevitable spontaneous interaction with a key decision maker in the hallway? What about that crucial moment during a performance review where the individual has to clearly and calmly articulate their value and request a promotion? If shyness prevents an otherwise capable individual from simply making a statement of fact or advocating for themselves in a routine, necessary professional exchange, well, that's not a systemic failure. That is the individual's failure to neutralize a paralyzing internal fear that is hindering their own goals. The pressure is external, yes, but the fear mechanism and the resulting behavioral paralysis are internal. We have to equip the individual with the psychological resilience to handle universal human challenges like unexpected judgment.
But we have to challenge the idea that these moments of spontaneous engagement are always beneficial. I mean, they're often performative rituals that prioritize speed over quality. Let's focus on the systemic solutions needed to truly dismantle the extrovert ideal. We need to mandate inclusive environments.
This means restructuring meetings, for example, requiring 5 minutes of silent contemplation before a discussion begins, ensuring the first contribution is written, or maybe rotating who is responsible for soliciting input from quieter members. By ensuring contributions are safer and more valued when they're measured and thoughtful, we inherently reduce the rational basis for the fear of judgment. If the system values detail over dominance, the associated anxiety weakens.
That's a powerful point, and I absolutely agree that accommodations and systemic reform are vital for maximizing introverted contributions. We must reform workplaces. However, I would frame the relationship differently. Systemic change creates better environments for introverts, but it does not inoculate the individual against the fear of judgment itself, which is often generalized across all sorts of situations. The core of shyness, that anticipation of negative evaluation, is a universal human vulnerability. Even in the safest environment, the individual needs the psychological tools to handle the rare but important moments when they are scrutinized or when they encounter necessary conflict. Without actively addressing that fear, the introvert is constantly operating with a self-imposed functional ceiling.
But why must we view it as a ceiling rather than a natural boundary? You assume that resilience is built only through confronting fear. I would suggest that resilience can also be built through self-knowledge and protective boundaries. If the systemic pressure is reduced, the individual can invest their finite emotional and cognitive energy into their core strengths. When we pathologize quietness, we force introverts to expend massive amounts of energy masking or performing sociability, which leads to burnout, reinforcing the idea that social interaction is inherently negative.
But emotional resilience is built specifically through challenging the limitations imposed by fear. We can learn to manage the fear of evaluation to achieve a kind of behavioral flexibility without abandoning our preference for solitude and deep thought. This is about psychological capacity, not preference. If we allow shyness to dictate opportunity, we are simply accepting a limiting factor that is frankly clinically treatable.
And I maintain that if we focus primarily on embracing introversion as a source of strength and ensuring environments value thoughtful contributions, we fundamentally change the question we should be asking. Is shyness an individual flaw, or is it simply the natural self-protective discomfort that results from relentless societal pressure to perform extroversion? We have to address the cause, which is often environmental, before we condemn the reaction.
I'll re-emphasize that shyness as a negative emotional barrier, rooted specifically in the fear of evaluation, undeniably limits personal and professional opportunity, and crucially, damages mental health through avoidance. While introversion is a valid and beneficial preference we must respect and accommodate, the specific hindrance of shyness must be actively neutralized to achieve full psychological resilience and functional self-advocacy.
Ultimately, what our material illuminates is the necessity of understanding the fine and often blurring nuances between a personality preference that should be celebrated and a disabling emotional state that should be addressed. We cannot effectively manage the fear response without simultaneously acknowledging and reforming the hostile environment that so often cultivates it.
Indeed, recognizing the difference is the crucial first step. And the journey toward both accommodation and the neutralization of debilitating fear requires multiple overlapping perspectives, both systemic reform and individual resilience, to fully appreciate this deep complexity.